A very good morning to you. This is a recording of a presentation that was done live in May 2026. It has now been recorded in studio to be available for those who weren't present and for future parents. My name is Robin Gibson. I'm a director at Harvard House, and the title of my presentation is Beyond Retirement, Planning for a Child Who Will Always Need You. So Harvard House, who are we? We're a boutique financial services group based in the Natal Midlands. We have satellite offices in Sandton and Somerset West to service the client base we've built there. We were established in 1972, so this is our 55th year in business. I'm doing this in 2026. And we offer a broad range of financial services: tax, accounting, wills and estates, financial planning, investment planning, short-term insurance, gap cover and life insurance. We're currently managing in excess of 7 billion directly on local and international markets, and we're journeying with more than 4,000 clients at present. We have 5 unit trusts co-branded with BCI or Fundrock Investments, and we've won 15 national investment awards with those unit trusts. We have 70 employees, 8 CAs, 2 attorneys, 7 certified financial planners, 3 masters of economics. We have a CFA level 2 and more than 200 years of combined experience. And there is a group of our clients who are now part of the 4th generation of the families that started with us back in the 70s. We are highly sensitized because of the nature of our work to some of the issues faced by this community. So the question nobody wants to ask is, most retirement plans are, will I be okay? But in this space, I think for most people who will be watching this, it's, will my child be okay when I'm no longer here? And that is the $50 million question. So in thinking about this, we think there's 3 pillars to suitable planning related to a child in a care facility like this. The first one is care. Who will look after them and what standard of care? This is not really our expertise, probably rests more in the Sunfield Homes, but we will do a slide on there based on our experience of what people have tried in this space and what may or may not work. The second issue is the pillar of control. Who makes decisions and who protects my offspring when I'm no longer here? I think that's key. And then the third one is probably the most crucial one, which is really where our key expertise lies, is on the capital. Will there be enough money and how will it be invested? So let's consider 4 what we think are silent failures of planning in this space. The first one is that you have money but no structure. So there's a lump sum inheritance, but the risks really rest around mismanagement or exploitation. Invariably, this space is where people leave people or individuals in a trustworthy position after they've gone and without foreseeing potentially some of the issues in that space. The second one is that people build a structure but they have no money. So a trust may exist but it runs out of money because there's been an underestimation of what the cost would be based on the life expectancy of the child. The third one that we see is the family assumption, where people just rely on their other children. My other children will take care of it. And without sufficient conversations, understanding, or even engagement, and typically that leads to resentment or breakdown somewhere down the line, which leaves the impaired child rather exposed. And then the fourth one, which we think probably happens very, very often, is what we would call a too late a transition. And so obviously this is a big part of your life. You're very involved, you set up the structures, you have control, but sometimes there's rapid parental decline. It might be a health event, it might be some sort of impact, and as a result what we find is that there's inappropriate care and emotional chaos, especially for the impaired child, who who doesn't cope with change particularly well anyway, but finds this a difficult environment to walk into. And so, yeah, those are the 4 areas that we see are pretty good or pretty common silent failures of planning in this space. So first of all, let's have a look at pillar 1, which pillar 1 would be the care. So we think that care could be delegated to specialized institutions. Sunfield Homes is obviously the prime example, one that's been long established. And the pros are obviously it's very focused and specialized care. It has a history of delivery. There's a lot of institutional knowledge that comes with this that's passed on. And it's a safe community for particularly the type of child that would come into that environment, because it's very much designed for them. The downside is obviously that because it is very specialized and very unique, the cost escalations could potentially, it's not a broad market that you're looking at, so the cost escalations could be higher than inflation, and that really is something that needs to be borne in mind. The other one is sustainability. Certainly these institutions have enjoyed government support historically, and they also do their own fundraising, but what is the situation around sustainability into the future, because it's such a small pocket or a small subset of the population? We have seen people consider frail cares or age in place, something like in our part of the world in Howick, Amberglades or Malwana, which is the old Pietermaritzburg and district care of the aged. Obviously there is a much better sustainability because it's serving a larger feed of the community. Because of that overall demand, there's a little bit more cost containment, I think probably because there are businesses in this space, and so you do have competitive pricing, and you have increased locations. There's not a lot of specialized institutional facilities like Sunfield, whereas retirement homes are far more widely spread. The downside is very generalized care. Is it age appropriate? I mean, your child might not be at that point, and then the question is how will they survive in that community, and is there an inherent community threat with it? And then the third one that we kind of see is residence with a family member, possibly a family with carer. Obviously it's focused, specialized care. There's some shared costs in terms of having them at home and running their own home from that point of view. And it is a safe community, largely because the relational aspect will keep them kind of really focused care from that point of view, and the heart would be towards them. The downside to that is that it is a 24-hour responsibility, and then one questions whether there could be some emotional fatigue over time, carer fatigue, as a result of the responsibility that goes with that. So that's really all we'll say relative to the care aspect. From there, it's not really our area of expertise. The second area I want to look at is the element of control. So let's look at the principles in control. Many people might not be aware of this, is that notwithstanding the intellectual capability of a child, guardianship, official legal guardianship, only extends until 18. Thereafter, without a formal court-actioned intervention, parents may not contract on behalf of and cannot stop their children contracting on their own. And that extends obviously even to an impaired child after 18. It is subject to common law principles of contracting capacity, but you would have to prove that the child didn't know what they were doing or the nature of the contract, and I'm not sure that will always be the case. So just something to be aware of. This probably comes up more in issues around the medical field and making medical decisions, and understanding that the child does have a legal right for some of these things, which can be a challenge. I would say at this point that the South African courts or the South African legal system just really doesn't cater particularly well for this kind of thing, and so you probably are finding yourselves in a little bit of a vacuum from that point of view. So what are the legal routes to go? The first one is known as curatorship, which is appointed by an application to the High Court, or administration, which is done in terms of the Mental Health Act. And these are the only two legal methodologies for legally administrating a major's affairs. A curatorship basically has two legs to it. It could be a curator bonus, which is really the administration and financial aspects, and then a curator personae, which is the medical and decision aspects around the body. That you can get one or the other, and can make decisions on either side, or you can do two similarly. Administration is less legally complex than curatorship. The administrator is appointed by the master, whereas a curatorship is an application to the High Court and requires a full legal process from that point of view. The master may reject an administration application in favour of a curatorship if circumstances or size of the estate is significant, and we would say that we don't think that, given where our master is in this country at this point, he's not going to take that option almost every time. We just can't see the master who would be required to do work and suffer a bit of burden of responsibility wouldn't just automatically redirect to curatorship. The curatorship, and I say here it's important to note, while these mechanisms exist in law, they are hugely problematic in practice. We see that lawyers are reluctant to act as curators. We certainly wouldn't act as a curator. We've done it once and wouldn't repeat that. It is administratively intensive. It is economically unviable as a professional, and highly risky from that point of view. And as we've said, the master is reluctant to appoint administrators. So it's really, there's not a lot available from here, but really your curatorship is the only real way that you could go forward. Possibly, if there are no assets, an administration would be easier to do, because the master does look based on size. So if the funds are locked up elsewhere under another mechanism, maybe he would consider it more readily. So let's just have a look at control. So what are the methodologies for controlling funds? Well, I mean, obviously you can go to a third party who would run the funds. So maybe a lawyer, a friend, a family member, who you could say, well, can they handle the assets from that point of view? We have a special trust, which is really designed around the tax aspects of impaired individuals. And there's some benefits of creating a legal entity around them without losing some of the tax benefits that you would get as an individual. Then you would get what's known as an inter vivos trust, which is, all it means is that the trust is created while people are alive. So as a founder, you'd create it while you were alive. Or the final one would be a testamentary trust, which would be a trust that's created in terms of your last will and testament. Now, just to point out, a testamentary trust can also be a special trust, as can an inter vivos trust. So it's really just about, am I going to form it while I'm alive, or in terms of my last will? And am I going to use full discretion on the trust, or am I going to make it a special trust? Okay, so if I go with a third party, it's held in the name of an individual. It's not really subject to third party accountability, so that's a family member. There's no reporting requirements to anybody. It would be taxed in that individual's hands. That might be the downside. And the risks are that on death of that individual, it will be subject to their will, and that might be where the difficulty comes, or the danger comes in, because we cannot assume that they will outlive the impaired individual. And then generally, because it's family or a friend, it's very cost efficient from a cost point of view. When we get into the realm of trusts, a special trust may only be formed for impaired individuals. and they will be required to have trustees nominated who are approved by the Master of the High Court. It will have to produce annual financial statements and submit a tax return, but it does enjoy a special tax dispensation, more aligned with individuals as opposed to trusts, which are taxed more heavily. On the death of the named beneficiary and subject to the trust deed, the capital can then move to potentially other individuals as named in the trust deed, or potentially your other heirs from that point of view. There is a cost to producing financial statements, professional trustees. I will touch on that a little bit later. An inter vivos trust is formed by a founder, and also will have trustees appointed that must be approved by the Master of the High Court. Also has to produce annual financial statements and submit a tax return. And any income that the trust retains and is taxable will be taxed at 45% from the very first rand. So you don't get a sliding scale like individuals do, nor do you get a capital gains tax exemption, and the capital gains tax would be higher in a trust. The termination is completely determined by the founding trustee, so that will be determined at the outset, and the costs would be around the financial statements, the professional trustees, and the submission of tax returns. The final one is the testamentary trust, which only comes into effect at the death of whoever is holding the assets that they want to bequeath. So the trust can be set up only after you're no longer here, and then everything related to normal trusts would apply: submitting tax returns, financial statements, professional trustees, taxation requirements. But the last will and testament effectively becomes the trust deed for the document. So just looking at the pros from that point of view, obviously your third party has independence, it's simple, it's speedy, it's cost effective, but the risk does lie with one person. There's no accountability and controls. If that person gets into financial difficulty, you could expose your own assets for your child into their space. You don't have to do the reporting, so there's really no cost of financial statements or any trustees required. Special trusts, we've kind of touched on those other things in there, pros versus cons, but just to give you an idea, the cost of financial statements is going to be asset dependent, but it'll be probably between 12,500 and 25,000 per year to run. And then just to bear in mind, from a trustee cost, all trusts are required to have what's known as an independent trustee. It doesn't necessarily have to be a professional trustee. However, it must be someone that the master is comfortable that they're comfortable with trust law and the requirements of trustees. And so it could be a family friend who's an accountant or a lawyer or something like that. But invariably, there's a good chance that you're going to have to employ a professional trustee, and typically they run round about 1% of assets with a minimum charge, obviously based on that, and then there may be charges for extra services like meetings, special meetings, minutes, trust changes, that kind of thing. And that really feeds through on all the trusts from that point of view, whether you're talking special trust, inter vivos, or a testamentary trust from that perspective. So things we should consider is that I think the trustees should definitely include a family member or a close associate who can offer insight into family dynamics or beneficiary status and condition. We sit on many trusts associated with impaired individuals or minors, and we cannot even begin to keep up with family dynamics, what's happening in the child's life. And some of those sort of softer things around decisions. We only really there to make decisions around money and things that fit into the legal aspect. And so you really, as trustees, really need guidance as to what's in best interest, what the dynamics are from a family point of view. And so trustees cannot be responsible for every aspect of the beneficiary's life. We're really making financial provision decisions. You're not effectively leaving your child to the trust. The trustees don't become responsible for taking them to the doctor or buying whatever they need in addition to what homes provide. So there are people who kind of think that that's what our job is. It's not what an independent trustee's job is. That really falls to family or others from that point of view. I've touched on the independent trustee requirement. But one thing I do want to point out is that independent trustees are bound to adhere to legal aspects and precedents. This is not the freedom to do whatever you want. There are very, very strict guidelines, and there's case law that shows how trustees should act. And for any independent trustee, there's a reputational and professional risk involved. They are putting their requirement on the line, so you may see that the payment of fees is a cost and feel it's unfair. But the reality is that there is a heavy burden that's placed on trustees, and they're required to know and to balance between these things. What's very important to know is a trust cannot be used as emotional leverage. We cannot start to say that because I'm a trustee and I'm in control of the money, you have to do this. And it really falls under the previous point, the legal aspects and the precedents drive. You cannot use a trust as a tool to leverage people's behavior. That's a completely different issue. We think that continuity planning should really be reviewed in this space, that you should be bringing people and make sure that there's a wide body of knowledge that knows the affairs so that people can step into the gap should circumstances change in one or more parties in there. And it should be regularly reviewed from that point of view. And we think that wider family communication should be very, very clear and consistent. Make sure that you know that everyone knows what the thinking is, what the plan is, what the future holds, and what has been put in place. We find that there's a lack of communication, which sometimes leads to friction after the fact. People try to then get involved in something that's actually been put together without an understanding of how it got there. And as a result, it leads to a fair amount of distress and difficulty at the transition, particularly for the impaired child. So the third pillar, which probably we'll dwell a bit more here because I think this is probably key. So the question is, how much is enough? And it's a question that everybody has, whether we're dealing for retirees or in this space. But it is a widely held question. So the first thing I just want to talk about is longevity. I did some research. I'm not an expert in the mentally impaired space, but the research tells me that back in the 50s and 60s, life expectancy was not really much longer than 30 or 35. It would appear that in developed economies, that life expectancy is much older now, probably into the 60s, sometimes the early 70s. But longevity is an issue that is happening all around the world. And here, this chart really shows you that longevity is, notwithstanding, Africa obviously having a lower life expectancy rate, but overall we can see the trend is for everyone to live longer no matter where they are in the world, and there's no doubt that this extends into this space, also the mentally impaired space, as a result of improvements in medical science and medication. So you definitely are dealing with and prepping for a longer period of time, and we would think that's the base idea to think about at this point. So let's just, I always think it's good to put some numbers to the exercise. So let's just have a look at this. You might say this is too much or too little, but typically monthly fees at Sunfield are around 20,000 at this point. Let's just assume a medical aid for for an individual like this is about 2,500 with a gap cover of 200. And then I'm going to assume that you've got a trust in place, and as a result the trustee admin and trustee costs, etc., 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 is about 5,000 rand a month. And then there's other spending, medicine, doctor's visits, etc., etc., out of hand, maybe some pocket money, etc., etc. So I get down to a figure of roughly 35,000 rand a month. Now you might say that's too high, or it's not high enough, but the principle will follow in the following slides. So just to give you an idea where we go from that point of view, sorry, just going backwards here, you can see how that 35,000 will escalate with inflation over time. So, you know, within 5 years we're at 40, almost 41. In 10 years we're close to 50. Another 10 years we're close to 60. And so that's the other thing people really don't give thought to in this planning is the impact of inflation over time in this space and where it could go from there. So just using that, we can see the bottom graph there, really the chart, the bars showing where we could go. So, I mean, if you have a child who's at, maybe they're at 30 and you're planning for them to live to 60 or beyond, well, that tells you that 35,000 in 30 years' time is going to be just at an inflation-adjusted number, about 109,000 Rand, based on current inflation, around about 4%. So if you would consider that inflation might be higher in this space, it could be a higher number. And then what the line does here, it says, if I was to make provision for total income, all the bars along the line for any given period, and I was to stuff that money into a safe and keep it there, then how much money would I need? So I'm not investing the money, I'm not putting it in a bank account, I've got no form of investments, I've just got the money in a safe, and every time I need to pay an account, I go to the safe and I pull the notes out. Then, for 30 years, I probably need 23.5 million. If it's only 15 years, I probably need 8.4 million. So we're actually coming down the line as life expectancy. You can see my cursor coming down there. If there's only 10 years, I might need about 5 million. So what that says is that those numbers are rather breathtaking. So what we would do from here is we say, well, obviously it makes sense to try and invest. So how would investing at a return at higher than inflation, how would that change the picture? So, and that's reflected in this chart here. So there's my initial chart where I'm not investing in anything at all. And I've used the 15-year mark as the case in point, which is the red line here, to give you an indication. So if I was able to get an investment return of inflation plus 2, very, very conservative, almost close to cash, not taking any risk, then my number's going to move from having to have 8.5 million Rand in the safe in cash notes down to just over 5 million in the safe, or in investments, earning very, very conservative investment. But if I could actually improve that return and get a return that's closer to inflation plus 6, which would require some exposure to risk in the stock market from that point of view, then the number would drop down to closer to just under 4 million. And what it really, really shows you here is that you cannot invest too conservatively for a income requirement that may be substantially longer. Otherwise, you're just going to need a bigger pillar of capital right in the beginning. We would say these are the only ways that you can really go and invest in order to provide for that future. These are the 4 basic asset classes: cash, money market, fixed deposits or call, bonds, which are government bonds or corporate bonds. And we would indicate that bonds is really nothing more than a tradable fixed deposit. You put your money in, you're guaranteed to get the capital back, you get a fixed interest rate in the interim, but should you sell it in between, you can either make a capital loss or a capital gain, depending where interest rates are relative to the interest rate on the piece of paper you've got. Then property, and we don't typically talk fixed property here. We generally talk the listed property space, largely because commercial property is far more stable than residential property, doesn't have as much sort of movement and change, and leases tend to be a lot longer. And then finally equity, which is really just buying shares in a company, mostly in listed companies on stock exchanges. And what sort of is the return profile that we can look at on that? So this goes back all the way to 1960, and it says every mark on the chart here represents a 3-year rolling return on the asset class over that time period, for the 3 years. And what it shows you here is that really inflation is the dotted line along the bottom there, and the only one that's relatively stable through all seasons is green, which is cash. But if you look through there, what you'll see is that cash hardly ever beats inflation. And in fact, when inflation is rising, cash tends to fall behind inflation, and you actually lose the value of your money relative to inflation. But obviously what people dislike is the volatility that comes with the equity market. So the dark blue is equity, the light purple is bonds, the light purple is property, the dark purple is bonds, and the green is cash. But if I take that, I've looked at 3-year periods here, if I take that and I extend that to 20-year periods, so now every point in the graph represents a 20-year return in that asset class. So you can see from 1960 through to 1979, which would represent that point there. There's a few things that become apparent. There is inflation. So in a declining inflation environment, I can see that I make money in cash. But as inflation starts to rise and as it normalizes, cash is really not an inflation-beating investment. Bonds also, in a rising inflation environment, lose money relative to inflation. You see that there. They do make money when interest rates are coming down and inflation is dropping, but as we can see, as inflation is moderated, the space between the bonds, which is the dark purple, and the dotted line is squeezed. What is really only beats inflation over all periods is equity. Property here is a little bit confusing from the point of view that our listed property market only starts here because we didn't really start getting listed property sector until the late 70s and didn't have much history. This period down here is really as a result of interest rates, prime interest rates going to about 21%, but we can see that that property can also handsomely exceed inflation over time from that point of view, and this we expect that this chart will normalize over time. But certainly equity is the only thing that substantially and constantly beats inflation over all periods and through all cycles. So just to illustrate that into numbers, if I assumed I had R1 million on the 31st of December 2025 and I discounted it at inflation, which was published inflation between 2004 and 2025 was 5.25% per year. And so if I take R1 million and I discount it by that 5.25% back to 31st of December 2004, I would have had 332,000 back then. So R1 million now, the equivalent inflation adjusted, would have been 332,000. And the question I then am going to ask is, if I invested that 332,000 into each of those asset classes back in December 2004, what would it be worth today? Bear in mind that my buying power would be the same if I had R1 million today. So where would I be? Well, first of all, cash. If I had taken all the interest and reinvested it into cash, I would have 1.4 million. However, if I'd eaten that cash in paying Sunfield fees, I likely wouldn't have that much money. If I look at bonds, because interest rates have come down over that period, bonds would have given me 2.3 million, so I would have been probably a lot better off. Property over that period would have grown to 7 million, and that's in spite of the COVID crash in 2020 and the collapse of our property sector in South Africa. So you still would have done very handsomely relative to inflation. And then had I been in the share market in equities, and this is local equities, and it's not taking international equities into account, my money would have been at 8.8 million. And so you can see just how material it is when you start to look at the numbers from that point of view. So coming back to closing thoughts, final thoughts, our checklist. The first one is, if you've got money but no structure, you should be really looking at your will and considering a trust, who your trustees are, and having some sort of family liaison from that point of view. That's where you should be looking. In case 2, if you've got structure but no money, you should really be sitting down to assess your requirements based on age and circumstances of your child. Make sure you're in appropriate investments, and you should be having a family discussion about the continuity into the future. If your assumption is family and you're expecting them to do it, I think you should be having a family discussion where everyone gets to air their views. I would say, in my experience, that's never done best by you. Sometimes it's better to have a third party who comes in to mention something, purely because a daughter-in-law might not be prepared to say something to you that they would say to someone else. And then make sure you cover the succession planning aspect. And then the final one is too late to transition. You need a sober assessment about the age you've reached and the events that can happen at your age group. You should be having a family discussion, and the succession planning and active handover should happen probably sooner rather than later. And I would argue that that's also to the benefit of your impaired child too into the future. That covers my full presentation. We did have quite a lengthy question and answer period in the live presentation, but I'm certain we would be happy to answer any questions, and so those could be emailed to us via Don to answer. Thank you for joining us. We hope you found this helpful.